Okay, so welcome everyone that's new and old friends to the LaRouche Pack, what would normally be your Monday strategic discussion. Certainly we were given a day yesterday to commemorate and celebrate the true independence of this nation, Independence Day, a celebration of the Declaration of Independence from the British Empire. And I hope people had a chance to reflect and really think through the future of this nation, because it is in our hands to deliver to the future. So as I said, welcome. My name is Michwa Steger, and we will be given a presentation by Michael Steger momentarily. I just want to start off. Obviously, we are in a tremendous situation in the world. You can really reflect on the fact that our enemy is probably the most desperate that we've seen in decades. And it's very clear. I mean, you've had Biden just completed the NATO and G7 summit. What took place there? You can blame everything everything that's going wrong in your life, in the country, in the world, on Russia. Russia is to blame. We can get into this, I'm sure, in the discussion, but certainly it seems like our enemy lives in a time warp or some type of time capsule, because they've been stuck on this for years now, this Russiagate theme. And the attempt to isolate Russia has not worked, because it's pretty clear there's two fronts to this. You have Russia continues. I mean, there are reports you probably read in the email that went out to advertise tonight's discussion that France is the top purchaser of liquefied natural gas from Russia. And of course, Belgium and the Netherlands follow suit. So they're definitely not isolated. The sanctions haven't worked. In fact, the special operation that Russia began in February to liberate Ukraine from these neo-Nazis has certainly occurred. It seems as if Russia has essentially won the special operation. You had a few days ago, the defense minister from Russia, Shoigu, announced that the LPR, the Luhansk People's Republic, has been liberated. And so this is blowing back in our enemy's face. Everything that you've seen, and this is really in the context of a new poll that's come out that indicates that 85% of the American population is disgruntled and upset with the direction that the nation is moving. If you really internalize 85%, that is certainly shocking. It's not shocking to us because we live this every day. We live reality every day, unlike these globalists and people in so-called leadership. But within this context of an 85% disapproval rating, essentially, what are people like Brian Deese saying? Brian Deese is the National Economic Economic Council chairman, who, even interviewers on CNN who are asking people like Brian Deese, well, how long should Americans expect to suffer $5 average, gas prices a gallon, or what's happening in the grocery stores, what's happening in everyday life for an average American citizen in this country? How long should we continue? And of course, what does Brian Deese say as a henchman for the Biden collective? He says that essentially we have to firm this up so that we have the capability of preserving this liberal world order. This is what these people represent. This is certainly why you see a growing mass movement in the United States, absolutely rejecting this, taking the question of Independence Day truly to heart and soul, to say this is a nation that was built on the good. There has been attempt after attempt to denigrate the soul of this nation, to denigrate the history of this nation. And what it's going to take is a concerted and coordinated and educated and passionate movement of citizens that really are equipped with the power of ideas, the power of the history of this nation, so that they can wield that against this enemy and deliver a final blow. Because I think we all sense it in our gut that this is the time to act. You may not know exactly what to do. You may not have the exact floor plan or bullet point plan in terms of what, all the steps. There are certainly specific steps that you can take, but the passion of the instinctual American impulse, that's really what we have to be attuned to. And I think everybody on this call is pretty attuned to that. So, our enemy, like I said, they want to tell us to suck it up. Well, we can tell them to essentially suck dirt, because that's what they can do. I think all the flags that I've seen throughout this weekend are very encouraging and inspiring, that as long as we have citizens in this country that are going to stand up and tell the truth about what they know, we have a winning chance in this country. So I would like to hand this off to Michael, introduce Michael Steger, and we will pick back up for the question and answer.
Thanks, Mihua. Nice to see everyone. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day. Appreciate everyone getting on, participating in these discussions, and taking the time to have what I view as a collaboration, to talk through pressing thoughts and questions on your minds as we all try to figure out, but each of us as individuals, how to shape the political and cultural atmosphere of our nation. We need a radical change in the question of the political culture of our nation. Maybe radical isn't the best word, some might say, but I think people know what I mean. We need a profound change in the political culture of our country. So I look forward to people's thoughts and concerns tonight and just discussing those through. I think we all find it helpful to have this quality of discussion on a weekly basis. And I'm going to touch maybe on why this discussion is so important, why these kinds of discussions, why these kinds of gatherings, though maybe they don't fit the mold of what people want to entertain themselves with, they're not ultimately entertaining. And for those of you watching on YouTube, we appreciate it. I appreciate your feedback, emails people send in, comments. But really, these are our presentations for just to set the table for a discussion around the old farm table, the old dining room table, on what are the concerns we have and how are we going to solve it and address it. It's not just simply to give an objective overview, and I'm going to touch on why that's not the case. But I did get some feedback from last Monday's discussion, and one in particular asked for a more comprehensive map of the battlefield. I thought that was an interesting question. We had a back and forth. I found the whole process very useful. From a standpoint that's maybe not obvious or literal, or not certainly what the person writing had in mind. Because in some sense, what are we dealing with here? Where is this war that we're fighting taking place? It is much like a war, but it's really much more of it's a cultural question. And in some sense, all war is that, even the war of actual combat artillery, like what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. This war situation, that's an expression, but what determines it is a cultural quality of identity, of leadership, and of morality. That's what determines the ability to effectively win wars. And the war that most Americans are actually engaged in is one not of combat and artillery. It is much more one of the cultural nature, but the same questions apply. It was a paper Mr. LaRouche wrote back many years ago called The People's War, where he kind of lays out this basic concept. And in many cases, the battlefield is the human mind. It is a moral dimension. And where does that moral dimension exist? It only exists in the human mind. Animals can have fear, they can have rage, they can become violent, but the ability to recognize the long-term objective and to fight for something of a higher principle, to take concern for others, is of a different question that's something separate from any animal response. It is that question of morality. And the question is, are we able to develop that within our population today? That's really the role all of us have, as does any general training or mobilizing his troops in actual combat, where he's not directly on the battlefield, he's not shooting, he's not engaged. I mean, in some cases, they may be closer to the front line, but in general, they're largely removed. The responsibility is to uplift, to guide, to inspire, and if everybody else is collapsing around them, to make sure that they have the capacity, the moral, emotional, and psychological capacity to elevate everyone else within their sphere, within their army, and even more broadly, their citizenry. You saw this from some of the best Soviet generals, even some of the American generals, certainly American Revolutionary War, the role of Washington, the role of Grant in the Civil War. But to moralize and to elevate the people around them that they're leading to fulfill the task at hand, because it can become grinding and grueling. And with the kind of psychotic culture, the mental health issues, the level of violence that has been deployed by our enemy as a cultural deployment against our nation, against our political culture, this becomes a grinding characteristic. And I think many people know what I'm talking about. Now, I did a quick survey of cable news. I don't often do that ever, really. I don't have cable. You can find it, on the internet. And all the discussion is on Highland Park. So let's just take up this incident and the question of violence on our streets and in our country, which everyone's obsessing over is the problem of guns. Well, if the problem was guns, then why did people pick out Highland Park and the incident there? Now, some might say it's because it's such a large shooting, 30 people injured. I think it's now 7 people have been killed. They're trying to say that this kid was like a Trump supporter. I don't know, pink hair and funky goggles and drug addiction and dressing like a woman. Doesn't sound like a traditional Trump supporter, but commentators and MSNBC want to depict this as somehow a typical Trump right-wing violent extremist. I mean, it's so detached from reality. But the obsession alone on Highland Park, all of the major news coverage just covered a press conference on this. The kid had a series of violent and psychological issues. We have a complete breakdown of mental health. In most cases, this kid, and it's hard to say, but it wouldn't be hard. You could take random selection and find 30, 40, 50, and maybe even higher percentage. Kids in their 20s today were on some type of psychological medication, especially if they have mental health issues today. They were on some type of psychological medication as early as 6 or 7 or 8 years old. And that will then lead into selling that medication, because downers for kids with mental health issues or uppers for the kids that don't have that same chemical imbalance. I mean, it creates a whole drug culture, and the drug question is massive in this country. And there's not one discussion of that, but there's no discussion of the 8 people killed and the 60 people wounded on the south side of Chicago over the same weekend. There's no major press conference. Everyone at the press conference in Highland Park is upper class. This is North Shore, Chicago. This is like, I don't know, it's like nice Long Island areas if you haven't been to the North Shore of Chicago. It's where all the North Shore movies came out of the 80s. It's like primo suburbs. Really nice. And yet 8 people are killed, 60 wounded in just random violence in the south side of Chicago. There's no major press conferences. It's not national television. And so it's very clear there is no intention by much of this to be addressed by the certain political establishment. But there is a growing state of festering violence. You see the same thing where it metastasizes, like the homeless situation in California. We have camps that have been there 6, 7, 8 years of 40, 50, 60 people in tents, in homemade shelters. They're building so-called homeless mansions on the side of the freeway in Los Angeles. It's just becoming a festering wound of drug addiction, sexual abuse, crimes, intimidation, terror in the streets for the population. This is why the city attorney in San Francisco was thrown out. We're just letting these things fester. And they throw their hands up and say, the only thing we can do, we can't deal with isolation, we can't deal with alienation, we can't deal with hopelessness, we can't deal with the lack of mission in our society. All we can deal with is drugs or guns. They don't even say the drugs. So this gets at, really, why are they going after President Trump so aggressively? And that just has to be stated that this is it's a Soviet show trial. And it's a massive distraction. It's a complete and total political fraud. It's meant to intimidate not President Trump, who's hard to intimidate, but anybody else who might be decent and want to work with him. But this show trial is also the obsession of the current culture or brainwashing program. And the third is, of course, the Ukraine situation. And as Michał mentioned, the real target of that is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump are perhaps the 2 most important people on the planet today. They represent, to a large extent, Trump still represents the true United States. They represent the 2 largest nuclear superpowers, 2 of the largest nations on Earth, and certainly 2 of the largest players that can shape what the 21st century actually becomes, against the violent terrorism, against the drugs, against the hopelessness. This is what Russia faced. They're trotting out Jeffrey Sachs again. If people don't remember, Sachs is the guy that ran shock therapy in Russia in the 1990s. He should be put in bars for crimes against humanity for what he did. Driving Russia into complete destruction while they just tore the country to pieces by oligarchs. Sound familiar? So Russia's made aggressive moves, successful, effective moves to secure what they said were their first initial steps, to secure those provinces in the southeast of Ukraine. But I think if anyone watching this situation knows, you see this this dynamic with Sweden and Finland. Now, the question was expansion of NATO. And Russia said it over and over and over again, starting in 99 when it first expanded, then again in 2000, I think it was 4 or 6, I think both, 2 more expansions. And then, of course, they moved on Ukraine, both with the Orange Revolution in 2005 and then the coup in 2013-14. We're now expanding again, and Finland shares the largest border with Russia. It's, of course, a much more rural area, but it's of a major national security concern for Russia. So in the course of this, we are grinding down Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. We've got a cokehead transvestite comedian as the president, as the stand-in for presidency of Ukraine. And the belligerence of this liberal world order, as Brian Deese called it over the weekend, suggests that Putin and Russia are going to have to do a lot more than just secure these provinces in the southeast of Ukraine. That there is an intention, whether it's a war with Russia and to bring down Putin, which regime change is the policy. Biden himself says that just like he talked about the greatest vote fraud program in history regarding prior to the 2020 election. And as Brian Deese said, we don't intend to lower gas prices. I think Biden said it in Japan. We're using this to create the Green New Deal. There's now a lawsuit, I think it's coming out of the state of Texas and the attorney general there, against the Security and Exchange Commission, because they're imposing that every corporation has to provide what their carbon emissions are and what their carbon footprint is. This is now part of an ESG, environmental sustainability and governance agenda, created by BlackRock and the other Wall Street, London operations. But this is embedded in every department. So yes, the Supreme Court ruled against the EPA, a major win against this out of control bureaucracy that wants to suffocate all American economic growth. That's a great win. But in reality, this thing is dominant, and they don't intend. They intend to continue to raise gas prices, even when oil prices have dropped now less than $100 a barrel. I think $20 or $30 off the peak. They're not intending to bring down gas prices. All they've done the entire time is blame corporations. They take no responsibility for all of the shutdown, all of the lack of confidence in a long-term carbon-based fuel supply. Germany reports that 1 out of every 2 Germans is worried about freezing in the winter. You're choking off the most industrial economy in Europe. Germany's imports now exceed their exports, the first time in something like 30 years. This is a nation, and the EU premised on exports of German products. Of course, Russia was a major buyer. They're no longer buying from Germany. So with all of the mistakes, with all of the failures, with all of the collapses, with all of the violence, with all of the degeneracy and mental health issues that have resulted in this counterculture, liberal world order agenda, with all the loss of manufacturing industry that was ripped out of Chicago and New York, small towns around the country, this collective regime gets on the table and says, you've got to continue to take it, because we've got to preserve the liberal world order. Now, what is the liberal world order? Well, ultimately, it's something that views most people as unnecessary. That's the fundamental premise. That's its intention. We've got to get rid of a lot of these hungry mouths, and ultimately, we can restore most of what we need based on artificial intelligence and robotics. You've probably heard this, the 4th Industrial Revolution. It's going to be the great savior of the Western economies. And they've been talking about it for 50 or 60 years. It's never going to solve the issue, because there is no objective solution with a crisis confronting human society. And any good general trained in the real classics, there's a piece that people can read that makes this clear by a German writer and general, Clausewitz, called On War. Something that people like Douglas MacGregor, the colonel, who's been very well spoken on the Ukraine situation and the coup against Trump, looked to, and it was written in the turn of the 19th century. But he makes it very clear that, and in that sense, the way he and they discuss it then, this question of war applies directly to anything regarding human society, including this deep cultural and economic crisis. There is no objective solution. There are things you have to have as broad outlines: national banking, public credit, infrastructure, power supply, advanced scientific research. But in the course of mobilizing those aspects, which can be considered our artillery, our actual means of deploying effectively against this cultural entropy, against this psychotic enemy, you have those tools, as those are part of the Constitution. That's why Hamilton insisted upon that as the constitutional basis, something like a national bank, because it was a critical device. If we were going to move the new nation, our new nation forward, we were going to need banking and credit extended for industrial production. But in the course of winning this and getting these policies achieved and getting a real Trump presidency that's not hampered by the neocon wing of Liz Cheney and Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton, all the wannabe presidents in the Senate, or any of the other ideological questions. We need the engagement of the full body of citizens in this country who are well aware we are going off a cliff. They are shutting down our energy supply. They've shut down our manufacturing industry. They've destroyed our culture. They're torturing our children. There's a loss of mission, a loss of purpose. We've got to change that immediately. But that doesn't happen objectively. It happens with each of us as individuals. No different than in war. It's the same is true in politics and in mobilizing an effective economy and mobilizing an effective industrial firm. It requires leadership and morality and concern for the productive individuals you're now asking to devote themselves to helping to secure a future beachhead for the coming generations. That this war is much more a cultural war. All wars are ultimately 99, 90%, 95% culture. What they called in the German, this classic by Clausewitz, Bildung. The development of a moral culture within the mind of an individual, a sense of civilization, a sense of scientific discovery, a sense of the greatest pieces of art that touch upon that unique distinction of the human mind, something only human beings could truly appreciate. Mature, adult, with the vast emotional expansion of adult human experience, which, as we all know, is broad, and it has great despairs and sadnesses and great joys and angers and frustrations. But it's that kind of music, that kind of artwork that captures it and ennobles the mind. This is where people like Beethoven and Mozart come from. This is the kind of culture our founding fathers hoped to create. This is the kind of culture Abraham Lincoln looked to instill during the Civil War. And we say we can't address the violence or isolation or alienation of our population. That is somebody who is mentally and totally castrated, completely impotent. The one thing we can do as individuals is mobilize to bring a sense of community and mission to our population. That is political leadership at its core. And that's ultimately why we have these discussions. That's why I always look forward to having a discussion every Monday night with people who are either running for office, taking up these questions, people that have been on for and been with us for 40 or 50 years, or others who might just be getting on for the first time tonight, to engage and find out what are your questions and concerns, what challenges are you having? Let's try to dialogue and discuss how do we get out of this. But hopefully, if anything, we're all emboldened to go into this week and into the course of this fight, knowing that we can secure real victory. It requires people engaging at this level, at the level of real generals, knowing that the future of mankind is at stake, and it's always at stake. That's what previous generations in the leadership of our country have just failed to understand. They became self-absorbed, narcissistic. They created a culture of psychopaths and sociopaths, instead of the ability to actually extend their thoughts and concerns towards other people. Trump epitomizes somebody who's fighting truly for the American people. And that's why they're going after him. Vladimir Putin expresses that same quality and commitment towards the people of Russia. What Russia has accomplished in 20 years, or 20 plus years now, is truly remarkable. And the email that was sent out for this discussion, even Marjorie Taylor Green has the insight and courage to say it directly. Russia is a great potential ally. It's going to be much more difficult given the intent to draw in a conflict, to actually have a conflict. This was intended. They wanted Russia to invade. They wanted to destroy Ukraine so they could expand their liberal world order or consolidate it with a clear enemy. Before it was Islamic terrorism, now it's going to be entirely Russia. We'll see if we can drag China into that as well. When the real problem the greatest foreign policy crisis on this planet is in Washington, D.C. And most of the people involved are probably on the January 6th panel. At least the spokesman for the globalist kind of slime that we deal with. So that may not be this discussion tonight, or this presentation may not be the same, but in my mind, the battlefield is much more, rather it's the strategic questions of how is Russia going to expand, where is this war going to go, the actual conflict between the US and Russia, or the various victories we've gained in the Supreme Court, or what's taking place within primaries in various states. The bigger question in my mind is to continue to make this movement, this patriotic uprising, increasingly more self-conscious that the war is won at an individual level, where we recruit individuals to have a greater understanding of what the war really is about. That was the victory of the American forces in the Revolutionary War. It was a sense of what they were fighting for was their own country. It wasn't a king. It wasn't a feudal lord. It was their nation, and it wasn't just their nation. It was something about the future of their civilization. And to the extent we instill that into the minds of our citizens today, we are going to win this. This enemy has no other options but to just impose its power. And that power is quickly shrinking. The question is, do we have the moral authority, the moral fitness to not only take that power, but to then deploy it effectively? And that to me really is the deciding factor in the war, and certainly the economic questions. Deploying our artillery, deploying advanced, as we've discussed on many of the Saturday classes with Brian Lance, on space, on power supply, on building the manufacturing centers, the nuclear power plants, getting our nation productive and young people with a mission is a huge, huge part of that. But what I want to make clear tonight is that it's part of this question of developing the quality of moral leadership, because in war, as in politics, and in leading our nation and civilization forward, you can never predict what circumstances are going to arise. You can't come up with a formula. You can't have a plan in the back room and then bring it forward and say, we just implement this and then we're going to win. It really is developing the capacity of individuals to engage in a sense of their leadership, to uplift others, into taking responsibility for the future of our society and our civilization. That's how this war is won. That's how every war is won. If it's a real war, it's a war for something. It's not a forever war where you're just grinding down people in a constant bureaucratic state of kind of imperial destruction. And I'm incredibly confident we can pull this together. And the calls every Monday are only an indication of that. So I'm going to basically stop there. Let's see if people have some thoughts and questions. Hopefully I provoke some regarding this dynamic, and then we'll see where it goes for the discussion tonight. So Mijo, I'll throw it back to you.